18 seconds. From the moment the driver's subconscious registered the anomaly on the road ahead to the moment his vehicle cleared the far side of the kill zone, 18 seconds elapsed. In that time, a decision was made that defied standard operating procedure, overrode basic human instinct, and directly contradicted years of risk-averse corporate training. It was a decision that saved 3 lives, secured over $5 million in bearer bonds, and resulted in the catastrophic failure of a meticulously planned ambush executed by a cartel kill squad. We are here to dissect that decision. Not the firefight, not the escape, but the 18 seconds of cognitive processing under extreme duress that determined the outcome. In this business, we have a saying: the vehicle is your weapon, your shield, and your coffin. You choose how you use it. The operation was what is known in the industry as a sweep run. It was the final collection on a multi-stop route, consolidating assets from several regional banking institutions into a single armored transport for end-of-day processing at a central vault. This particular sweep run occurred on a Wednesday, the 3rd of the month, a pattern that had been established over 2 years of incident-free operations. The route covered approximately 120 kilometers of urban and suburban roadway. The vehicle, a specialized cash-in-transit truck, was operated by a 3-person crew: a driver, a passenger side guard responsible for communications and observation, the comms man, and a single guard in the rear cargo compartment, whose sole responsibility was the integrity of the asset. The predictability of this routine was its greatest vulnerability. High-frequency, high-value movements that follow established patterns are the bread and butter of sophisticated criminal organizations. They are, from a tactical perspective, an invitation. The security protocols in place were robust, but they were designed to counter smash-and-grab attacks, opportunistic criminals, and low-level threats. They were not designed, as we would soon discover, to counter a military-style ambush predicated on a catastrophic intelligence failure within the security apparatus itself. The enemy knew the route, the timeline, the vehicle type, and the value of the cargo. They knew everything except the psychological composition of the man behind the wheel. The vehicle itself was a state-of-the-art machine, at least on paper. It was a chassis cab truck from a major automotive manufacturer, heavily modified by a specialized security vehicle company. The armor package was rated at CENB 6, capable of defeating multiple impacts from rifle-caliber rounds up to 7.62 by 51 millimeters NATO. The glass was a multi-layer laminate of polycarbonate and leaded glass, nearly 3 inches thick, designed to stop the same threats. However, B6 level protection is not an impenetrable fortress. It is a statistical guarantee under specific conditions. It degrades with each impact. Successive rounds on the same area can cause delamination, structural failure, and, most critically, a phenomenon known as spalling. Spalling occurs when the kinetic energy of a non-penetrating impact is transferred through the armor, causing fragments from the interior face to break away at high velocity, turning the inside of the safe compartment into a shrapnel-filled blender. The vehicle was a shield, but a shield that could break. Its defensive systems were standard for the industry. The tires were run flats, featuring a reinforced composite ring that allowed the vehicle to maintain mobility for up to 50 kilometers at reduced speed after a complete loss of air pressure. The engine block and fuel tank were wrapped in ballistic blankets. The cabin featured an independent, filtered air supply to defend against chemical agents and an overlapping plate design at all door seams to prevent splash from high-pressure explosives. It weighed approximately 9,000 kilograms fully loaded. It was a mobile vault, powerful but ponderous. Its greatest asset was its momentum. Its greatest weakness was its inertia. The crew was professional and experienced, but only one of them truly mattered in the moments to come. The rear guard was a 24-year-old man on his 6th month of the job, armed with a standard-issue pump-action shotgun and locked in a windowless steel box. His role was to be the last line of defense, a human lock. The comms man, in the passenger seat, was a veteran of the industry with 15 years of service. His job was to observe, to operate the encrypted radio, to be a second set of eyes. But in a compressed, high-speed ambush, his ability to influence the outcome was negligible. The fight belonged entirely to the driver. He was 47 years old. He had spent 6 years in his country's military as a combat engineer, followed by a decade in law enforcement on a tactical response team. For the last 12 years, he had worked in the private security sector, the last 5 as a high-threat response driver. He had driven dignitaries through unstable regions and escorted valuable assets through contested territories. He had been shot at before. He understood the geometry of an ambush. He had studied the methodology of professional crews from Belfast to Bogota. He knew that the moment a vehicle stops in a kill zone, the crew's life expectancy is measured in seconds. This knowledge was not an abstract concept learned in a classroom. It was a core component of his professional being, a foundational truth etched into his nervous system through training and experience. The critical vulnerability was not the route, the vehicle, or the crew. It was information. A subsequent investigation would reveal a long-term, low-level cyber penetration of the security firm's logistical servers. For months, a highly disciplined cell connected to a major transnational trafficking organization had been harvesting data. They were not smash-and-grab opportunists. They were professionals. They had schedules, vehicle specifications, response time data from local law enforcement, and satellite imagery of the entire route. They had planned this operation with the meticulous detail of a special operations mission, and they had chosen their ground perfectly. The intelligence failure was absolute. It placed a 9-ton truck carrying $5 million into a perfectly prepared ambush box, with no warning and no support. The entire corporate security infrastructure had failed. The fight was now down to one man, his training, and 18 seconds. The chosen location for the ambush was a stretch of 4-lane highway, approximately 15 kilometers outside the city's dense urban core. Specifically, they chose a section of road just before a slight crest, with a concrete overpass situated 300 meters beyond the rise. This terrain offered the attackers several distinct tactical advantages. First, the crest of the hill would mask their blockade vehicle from the target's view until it was too late to decelerate or divert without aggressive action. The optimal engagement range for their weapons would be achieved almost instantaneously. Second, the overpass provided an elevated firing position, allowing them to shoot down into the less heavily armored roof of the target vehicle. Third, the roadway was flanked on both sides by steep, wooded embankments, making an off-road escape impossible for a vehicle of that weight and class. It was a classic channelizing tactic, forcing the target into a pre-selected fatal funnel. The attackers themselves were not common criminals. Forensic analysis of the scene, coupled with intelligence gathered after the event, painted a clear picture. This was a team of at least 8 men, likely with prior military or special operations experience. Their weapon systems were standardized, AK pattern rifles chambered in 7.62 by 39 millimeters, a common and reliable choice, but their primary casualty-producing weapon was a belt-fed machine gun, likely a PKM, also chambered in 7.62, but in the more powerful 7.62 by 54 R-rimmed cartridge. This weapon was positioned on the overpass, intended to pin the vehicle and suppress any effective response from the crew. Their communication was disciplined, their movements were economical, and their setup was professional. They had established a primary blockade using a stolen flatbed truck, positioned sideways to block the two right-hand lanes in which the armored truck was traveling. A secondary vehicle, a heavy sedan, was positioned behind the target's expected stopping point to act as a rear trap, or anvil. The entire setup was a textbook ambush envelope. Their plan was predicated on a single, core assumption. It was an assumption born of careful study of standard operating procedures for cash-in-transit security in that region. They assumed compliance. They believed the driver, when faced with an unexpected blockade, would do what every training manual instructed him to do. Stop the vehicle a safe distance from the obstacle, report the situation via radio, and wait for instructions or for the obstacle to clear. This pause, this moment of hesitation, was the linchpin of their entire plan. In that static moment, the vehicle would transform from a mobile fortress into a stationary metal box. The machine gun from the overpass would open fire, pinning the crew and degrading the vehicle's armor. The flanking assault teams would then advance, using overwhelming concentrated fire to breach the driver and passenger side windows, neutralizing the crew before turning their attention to the rear cargo hold. It was a sound plan. It was logical. And it was this very logic, this intellectual arrogance, that constituted their fatal flaw. They had planned for the procedure. They had not planned for the man. At 6:47 p.m. and 15 seconds, the armored truck crested the gentle rise in the highway. The time was late autumn, and the light was beginning to fail. The driver was in a state of relaxed alertness, his eyes methodically scanning the road ahead, his hands resting lightly on the wheel at the 9 and 3 o'clock positions. The comms guard was completing a routine status check with dispatch. The ambient noise was the low rumble of the diesel engine and the hum of the tires on asphalt. It was a moment of absolute normalcy. Within 90 seconds, that stretch of asphalt would transform into a kill zone. The driver's first observation was the flatbed truck, positioned unnaturally across the lanes of travel, approximately 200 meters ahead. There were no flashing lights, no road crew, no signs of an accident. It was simply there. This was the first input, the observe phase of the cognitive process, known to tacticians as the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act. For the average motorist, this sight would trigger confusion, perhaps annoyance. For the comms guard, as he reported later, it triggered the first flicker of alarm. He saw an obstacle. The driver, however, saw something different. He did not see an obstacle. He saw a trigger. The orient phase began instantly. His mind, conditioned by years of threat analysis, began to process the input against a vast library of learned patterns. An empty truck, blocking the primary lanes of travel, just over a blind crest, with a clear overpass ahead. The context was wrong. This was not a breakdown. This was a setup. While the comms guard was still formulating his initial report to dispatch, the driver's orientation was complete. His threat assessment escalated from anomaly to ambush in less than a second. He was now operating on a different cognitive plane from his partner, a plane where the normal rules of road safety were suspended and the brutal physics of combat took precedence. This is the crucial disconnect that so often leads to fatalities in such situations. One crew member is still operating under a normalcy bias, while the other has already crossed the mental threshold into a life-or-death engagement. Standard operating procedure in this scenario was clear, unequivocal, and fatally wrong. Standard operating procedure dictated that the driver should slow the vehicle, stop at a safe distance of no less than 50 meters, and use the vehicle as hard cover while the comms guard reported the threat and requested law enforcement backup. Standard operating procedure was designed by lawyers and insurance adjusters to minimize liability. Standard operating procedure was a death sentence. To stop was to cede the initiative. To stop was to become a static target. To stop was to willingly place oneself in the center of the pre-prepared killing field and wait for the enemy to act. Static defense is death. The decide phase of the OODA loop was therefore not a choice between multiple options. It was a binary decision between training and survival. Stop, as procedure dictates, or accelerate, as instinct and experience demand. He chose to accelerate. At 6:47 and 21 seconds, his foot moved from the accelerator to the floor, depressing it fully. The 9-ton vehicle, which had been cruising at 80 kilometers per hour, began to surge forward. The comms guard, startled, began to question the action, his hand reaching for the radio handset. His OODA loop was hopelessly behind the driver's. He was still trying to orient to the problem, while the driver was already acting on the solution. That action triggered the ambush. The attackers, seeing the vehicle accelerate instead of braking, realized their assumption of compliance was false. They were forced to initiate their plan prematurely. At 6:47 and 24 seconds, the first shots rang out. These were not the wild, unaimed spray of amateurs. These were deliberate, aimed shots from the flanking team on the right embankment. The distinctive crack of 7.62 mm rounds impacting the B6 rated glass filled the cabin. 3 rounds struck the driver's side window in a tight grouping, causing a spiderweb of cracks and instantly obscuring his view. The percussive force was like a sledgehammer blow to the side of the head. This was the psychological disruption phase of their attack, designed to stun and disorient. Simultaneously, the heavy machine gun on the overpass opened fire. The sound was not a series of cracks, but a deafening, continuous roar, like canvas being ripped apart, that vibrated through the very structure of the truck. Rounds hammered the roof and hood, puncturing the sheet metal, shredding wiring, and striking the armored engine block. This was the suppressive fire, designed to pin the crew down, prevent any return fire from the vehicle's gun ports, and begin the systematic degradation of the vehicle's armor. The cabin was filled with the acrid smell of cordite and the sharp tang of ozone from shorting electronics. The comms guard was shouting into his radio, but the noise was overwhelming. The driver was now effectively blind. His primary view forward was a mosaic of fractured glass. His side windows were compromised. His auditory sense was overwhelmed. He was driving a 9-ton projectile by memory and feel, aimed at a target he could no longer clearly see. But his decision was made. There was no reversing it. The only way out of the kill zone is through it. He held his course, his foot locked to the floor. The truck was now traveling at nearly 100 kilometers per hour. The distance to the flatbed blockade was closing rapidly. At 6:47 and 27 seconds, the rear trap element, the heavy sedan, made its move, accelerating to close the back of the ambush box. The assault teams on the flanks began to advance, firing as they moved, closing the distance to the truck. They were executing their plan, but they were reacting, not dictating. They had lost control of the engagement's tempo. The driver's decision to accelerate had collapsed their timeline and forced them into a reactive posture. He had gotten inside their OODA loop. The act phase culminated at 6:47 and 30 seconds. The armored truck, weighing 9,000 kilograms and traveling at 28 meters per second, struck the flatbed truck just forward of its rear axle. The physics of the collision were absolute. The kinetic energy transferred was immense, in the realm of 3.5 million joules. The flatbed, weighing roughly 7,000 kilograms and being stationary, was lifted and thrown sideways. The sound of the impact was a deafening shriek of tearing metal, a fundamental violation of structural integrity. The armored truck's reinforced bumper and chassis acted as a battering ram. It did not simply push the blockade, it annihilated it. The flatbed was shunted into the concrete retaining wall, its frame buckling and twisting. The impact inside the armored truck's cabin was brutal. The crew, though belted, were thrown forward with violent force. The driver, anticipating the impact, had braced himself against the steering wheel, his arms absorbing a massive amount of the shock. The comms guard was thrown against his harness, suffering a fractured clavicle. In the rear, the cargo guard was tossed like a doll in a box, striking the steel wall and losing consciousness. But they were alive. The vehicle's immense mass and structural reinforcement, designed to withstand ballistic attack, also served to preserve the crew compartment during the collision. For a critical 2 seconds, the armored truck was entangled with the wreckage of the blockade. Its forward momentum was almost entirely spent. The engine, having ingested shrapnel from the machine gun fire, was screaming in protest, coolant and oil pouring from punctured lines. But the run-flat tires, though shredded, were still functional. The driver, ignoring the chaos in the cabin and the alarms screaming on his dashboard, shifted the transmission into a lower gear and again floored the accelerator. The massive diesel engine responded, the drive wheels bit, and the truck clawed its way through the mangled steel, free of the primary obstacle. He had cleared the kill zone. The entire engagement, from the first shot to clearing the blockade, had taken less than 10 seconds. The attacker's plan was in ruins. The machine gunner on the overpass ceased firing as the truck passed beneath him, his angle of fire eliminated. The flanking teams, who had been advancing on a stationary target, were now left behind, their own blockade vehicle now an obstacle preventing their pursuit vehicle from giving chase. The irony was tactical perfection. The trap they had set for their target had now trapped them. The escape was not clean. The truck was mortally wounded. It limped down the highway for another 2 kilometers, trailing smoke and fluids, its tires shedding rubber. The driver knew he had only moments before a catastrophic engine failure or fire. He pulled the vehicle to the side of the road, well clear of the engagement zone, and finally brought it to a stop. He keyed his personal emergency beacon, a redundant system separate from the main communications panel, which was now dead. Then, and only then, did he turn to check on his crew. The entire event, from the moment he saw the blockade to the moment the truck stopped, was less than 2 minutes. In that time, the attackers had fired an estimated 300 rounds of both 7.62 by 39 millimeters and 7.62 by 54 R. The vehicle sustained over 70 direct hits to the cab, hood, and roof. The number of penetrations into the crew compartment was 0. The aftermath was a study in contrasts. When law enforcement and the security firm's rapid response team arrived on scene, they found the armored truck 2 kilometers down the road from the ambush site. The vehicle was functionally destroyed. The engine was seized, the front axle was bent from the impact, and every body panel on the forward half was riddled with bullet impacts. The driver's side window was a cratered, opaque mass of fractured glass, having stopped at least a dozen rounds. The roof was perforated in multiple locations where the machine gun rounds had found purchase between armor plates. The electronic systems were dead. But the structural integrity of the crew cabin had held. The cargo compartment was entirely unbreached. The crew was injured, but alive. The driver suffered severe bruising to his arms and chest from bracing for impact, along with minor lacerations from glass spalling that had been defeated by his ballistic vest and goggles. The comms guard had a fractured clavicle and a moderate concussion. The rear guard, who had been unsecured, suffered a severe concussion and a dislocated shoulder. None of the injuries were life-threatening. The cargo, $5 million in negotiable bearer bonds, was completely secure. The mission, in its most fundamental sense, was a success. The asset was protected. The crew survived. The scene at the ambush site told a different story. The attackers' return on investment was 0. Law enforcement found the wrecked flatbed truck and a significant amount of forensic evidence. Blood trails indicated that at least 2 of the assault team members had been struck by flying debris from the collision or ricochets from their own fire. The subsequent investigation, aided by the intelligence recovered from the scene, led to the dismantling of the entire trafficking organization's regional cell within 6 months. The attackers had not only failed to secure the asset, but their failure had directly led to the destruction of their network. Their meticulous plan, so perfectly designed for a compliant target, had catastrophically backfired when faced with a non-compliant one. One of the wounded attackers was apprehended, and his debriefing confirmed their fatal error. They had profiled the security company's procedures, not the psychology of a combat veteran. They had calculated everything except the human element. This event provides a series of critical lessons for the security industry, lessons that must be analyzed and integrated into future operational planning. It is a perfect case study in the dynamic relationship between technology, procedure, and the human factor. The success of this crew was not a single point of victory, but a complex interplay of factors where the failure of one system was overcome by the success of another. First, we must acknowledge the absolute supremacy of the human factor in high-stakes critical incidents. The B6 rated armor did not defeat the ambush. The run-flat tires did not win the engagement. The encrypted radio was useless. All the technology, all the millions of dollars invested in hardening the vehicle, did one thing and one thing only. It bought time. It bought the driver the precious few seconds he needed to observe, orient, decide, and act. It was a buffer, a window of opportunity. But technology cannot make a decision. A truck cannot have courage. The outcome was determined not by the thickness of the glass, but by the quality of the man behind it. His decision to defy procedure and ram the blockade was the single pivot point upon which the entire event turned. This highlights the critical need for security recruitment to prioritize psychological resilience and a capacity for aggressive, independent decision-making over simple compliance and rote memorization of procedures. Second, the failure of the attackers must be closely examined. Their plan was tactically sound, their equipment was appropriate, and their execution, up to the point of contact, was disciplined. Their failure was intellectual. It was a failure of imagination. They had planned against a protocol, not a person. They had created a perfect problem, but they had only conceived of one possible answer. When the target provided a different, unexpected answer, their entire system collapsed. This is a lesson for both sides of the conflict. For security professionals, it underscores the need to be unpredictable. For our adversaries, it is a stark reminder that the most dangerous variable in any equation is a well-trained, determined human being who refuses to play by the established rules. Their arrogance lay in believing that a corporate manual held more sway over a man's actions in a kill zone than his will to survive. From this synthesis, we can distill 4 core tactical lessons that have since been integrated into advanced training curricula. 1. Intelligent security is the foundation of all physical security. The most advanced armored vehicle and the best trained crew in the world are still profoundly vulnerable if the enemy knows where you are going and when you will be there. The fight was nearly lost before the truck ever left the depot. The cyber breach that leaked the operational data was the inciting incident. It emphasizes that in the modern era, firewalls are as important as armor plate. A robust defense-in-depth security posture must treat digital and physical vulnerabilities with equal gravity. 2. Static defense is death. This is an aphorism as old as warfare itself, yet it is constantly forgotten in the corporate security world. The moment the vehicle stops, it becomes a coffin. The attacker's plan relied entirely on this principle. The driver's actions reaffirmed its opposite. Mobility is life. All training, all procedures must be re-evaluated through this lens. Protocols that encourage or mandate a static response in an ambush scenario are not security procedures. They are liabilities. The only purpose of the vehicle once an ambush is initiated is to break contact and exit the kill zone as violently and as quickly as possible. 3. Equipment buys time, but training determines outcomes. This cannot be overstated. The B-6 armor absorbed the rounds, buying the driver the seconds needed to act. The run-flat tires allowed the vehicle to escape after the engagement. The technology performed its function perfectly. But the function of technology is not to win the fight. It is to enable the operator to win the fight. The investment in hardware must be matched, if not exceeded, by an investment in high-fidelity, stress-based scenario training that forces decision-making under duress. The driver did not have time to consciously think through his options. He reacted as he was trained, with a deep, instinctual understanding of ambush dynamics that superseded the corporate checklist. 4. Methodology must evolve to match the sophistication of the threat. This was not an attack by common criminals. This was an attack by a professional paramilitary organization using military tactics. Security firms can no longer afford to plan for the most likely threat. They must plan for the most dangerous threat. This requires a paradigm shift from a reactive, compliance-based security model to a proactive, threat-based one. It means employing active counter-surveillance, route randomization, and adopting tactics of unpredictability that disrupt the enemy's planning cycle. It means treating cash-in-transit operations not as logistics, but as low-intensity combat missions. In the final analysis, the event was a catastrophic failure of corporate intelligence and a stunning success of individual tactical brilliance. The system failed, but the man succeeded. The institution had put him in an impossible situation, and his training, experience, and sheer force of will got him out of it. It serves as a permanent reminder that security is not a passive state achieved through technology, but an active process driven by human intellect and resolve. This brings us to a final, crucial concept: the mental bridge. In any profession that involves performance under extreme stress, the surgeon, the fighter pilot, the tactical operator, there exists a psychological crossing point where training becomes action. It is the moment when conscious thought ceases and instinct, honed by thousands of hours of repetition, takes over. It is a bridge that must be built long before it is needed. It is built in the mind through relentless study, practice, and visualization. The driver in this incident did not decide to accelerate in those 18 seconds. The decision had already been made years before, on a training course, in a debriefing, or while studying the after-action reports of other failed ambushes. The 18 seconds were merely the moment he walked across the mental bridge he had spent his entire career building. The fight goes to those who understand that the only way out of the kill zone is through it. End of debrief.